first is a series of benefits externally to Southeast Asia. The second is a series of benefits to India internally. The third is why this integration is essential for India's economy in the long term, both geopolitically but also economically. And finally, on why we de-escalate relationships with China and appease them in a way that's quite helpful. Firstly, though, I'm going to provide two pieces of setup. The first is an explanation of what we think RCEP actually looks like. We note a few things. The first is that, do you want me to pause while you get a pen, or are you good?
No, it's all good.
Okay, the first is that it's a looser form of free trade agreement. So what that means is it doesn't completely eliminate countries' ability to implement things like tariffs, but it certainly does decrease them. It also is flexible in terms of which products are protected, which means that it's a particularly adaptable sort of policy. The other thing we would note, though, is it does help with things like standardization, particularly in terms of digital economies, and we know that India is a world leader in that particular facet of economic growth. And secondly, things like food safety. Second piece of setup is an explanation of why India actually left RCEP in 2019, and that's because at the time it was a politically strategic and expedient move, and that's for a few reasons. One, there were border issues with China and Kashmir. And what that means is that they were the best way to kind of fix those issues was to exit RCEP at the time. The second thing is there were a huge amount of internal protests in relation to the farming community, and a good way to appease them was to exit this agreement at the time. But the thing that we would note now is that one, the situation with China has literally not changed at all since that point, so it's clear that leaving this agreement is actually not going to have any meaningful impact on them, so at this point we should actually try and appease them. But secondly, the situation with the farmers, like they have been appeased, and we can actually prove to you later why we're going to give them a series of benefits that will outweigh anything that this negative team is going to tell you about that particular stakeholder. Firstly, let's explain a series of growth and mutual benefits that we can provide. First are external to other countries that are a part of this agreement, and the second is specific to India. Firstly, let's talk about the external benefits. And the context that we would provide here is that Southeast Asia is just a massive growth market. We'd note that 2/3 of the world's growth are based in Southeast Asia. They have extremely young population, and their economies are only on an upwards trajectory, particularly given the industries in which a lot of these countries tend to specialize in. So why do we think India is actually going to create benefits in this sector? The first thing we'd note is that those benefits only, and free trade only occurs at the point where it is mutually beneficial. So we'd note the fact that this just empowers a huge amount of free trade and lowers those barriers, which are just intuitively create better access and reasons to do free trade. But the second thing is an explanation of the uniqueness of India. And the thing that we would note here is that their population being so big just means they do provide a massive amount of demand for a lot of goods that these countries produce, particularly in the electronic market. And so that means that decreasing those barriers to trade are just really helpful for everyone, because India can receive and other countries can get that financial return. But the second thing is that they're also just a manufacturer of a lot of goods, particularly in the IT sector and agricultural sector. So there are benefits to their own producers to be able to export those goods. Let's impact this argument, and I think there are three things. The first thing is that there's now increased synergy between these countries. We know particularly this looks like Japan and South Korea, who import a huge amount of food from India, and this increases food security on net in that block, which is just a benefit to everyone, because note the fact this is not an active debate. Second of all, it allows for specialization, which is obviously good because it means that India is less self-reliant, and it means that they can actually work economies of scale in the instances in which those can occur in their specialized fields. Thirdly, it just means on net people get access to cheaper products. That is an intuitive benefit of free trade, but that has a few impacts. The first is decreasing people's cost of living, and that's particularly beneficial in this block because it allows that money to be shifted away from goods and services and towards things like social mobility and investment, which is particularly useful for constituents on the ground there. Secondly, though, it empowers investment in other countries because now when there's less tariffs, you have more flexibility of how you can actually use your money, and it means that there are lower risks to other companies coming and investing in your country because it's easier for them to access it. But thirdly, we know that shortages are now less prevalent and less acute when they do happen, particularly for things like rice, by virtue of the fact that when you have less price volatility, when you have more free trade, it means that people actually just have access to goods in a way that is far more secure, and that is a benefit for everyone in that block. Secondly, what are the internal benefits to India of joining? Because even though this isn't an active debate, both teams should just prove the impact from India domestically. And we think they're fourfold. The first is that you just get a massive increase in FDI, and that's because the signalling effect of joining RCEP is just massive, because a lot of companies at the moment internationally are deciding between investing more in the West or in India. Like, that is their choice calculus, right? And they're more likely to opt into choosing India at the point where they seem more regionally integrated and seem like they're more open to free trade. And this is just a really easy way for them to do that. We know the fact that India now seems like a market they can trust, because at the point where they're willing to give and take with this kind of agreement, it probably probably signals that they are better. The second thing though is it means that India is actually less self-reliant, and so that means that when you can import extra things, you can instead shift your population to upskill and to work in higher level fields, instead of, for example, having to have a heap of people in steel manufacturing and concrete production. We know the fact that India is currently in a construction boom, and so that means the amount of demand they have for things like steel and wood and concrete are massive. And when you're able to import those from other countries instead, it means that you can do less exploitative labour, for example, in producing those things, and instead just get them from places like Australia. The third thing we'd note though is in terms of farmers, and this is that their agricultural market can now actually sell their goods on an international scale. And I'm sure this negative team is going to prove that, well, they'll just be outcompeted by other countries. But there's a few reasons why that's not true. And the most important one is just the land in India is particularly arable, which is factually true, but is also structurally true by virtue of the fact that like glacier runoffs of the Himalayas make that land particularly high in minerals, which means those goods are of quite a high quality and quite easy to produce. Thank you, Charlie, for that information. And so that just improves the income of farmers on the ground, because it means that they can sell their goods in a market where they can just charge quite a lot for them. We'd also note the fact that the flexibility of this agreement means that they can actually still have tariffs on the most vulnerable set of farmers, but on the other set of farmers that can actually meaningfully compete, they're able to get a huge economic benefit. But the last internal benefit that we note is that you now, considering you're a signatory on this agreement, just means that you have much more power and say in what that agreement actually says, and it means that you're able to make decisions that are most strategic to you as a country, as opposed to being isolated and locked out from ever making those decisions. Second argument is about integration, and there are two things here. Firstly, why do we think you get better engagement with ASEAN? The first thing is that the priority of ASEAN is to develop faster. That is the most important thing for them, because they just have an extremely high need for development, and they want to emulate the previous successes of other Southeast Asian countries that have had those success stories. And so what that means is that it is really important to be a part of that trade bloc, because they are just increasing their levels of development. And we think that RCEP is just a cornerstone of trust, because it signals that you are more willing to be flexible, and it means that India is seen as less of a threat. And we note the fact that considering India under the status quo is increasing in levels of military, there's quite a high level of anxiety in Southeast Asia surrounding India, and so this is just quite a good way to appease other countries, because it shows, for example, Cambodia, that you actually are willing to cooperate, you are willing to be less selfish, you are willing to give and take, and you're willing to put your money where your mouth is and engage with them in a way that is actually meaningful. But the other thing is that ASEAN is just a really key mediator, so it means that you're less likely to have escalations and arm races and prevent those things happening at the point where you seem and appear to be more flexible. And that is obviously a benefit, because one, it means you're more easily able to negotiate on things like diplomatic issues and have diplomatic unity, particularly looking at peace in Myanmar, for example. But second of all, you're able to negotiate around refugees and the facilitation of them, and that is a benefit. Last piece we're going to bring you is about de-escalation with China, and Eugene is going to prove this. But essentially our claim here is just that the line of control is currently at a stalemate, and this is just a really helpful olive branch that you're able to provide to them. But at the end of this debate, you should note two things. The first is that you're able to provide a huge amount of external benefits in this regional bloc when India is a part of it, because of the specific nature of that country. But second of all, the benefits to the constituents in India, access to goods and services, access to exporting and importing without tariffs, is just massive. Those economic benefits have to be outweighed quite significantly by this negative team to win the debate.
Starting in 3, 2, 1. Eugene is literally my mentor. All of these people are incredible debaters. They have like amazing debating skills. But I'm very sorry to tell you, they have literally no knowledge of how the RCEP works, or how India works in this case, or even China works. That's literally all I'm going to do in this debate. Correct a lot of the misconceptions they've given you. Almost half of that speech really wasn't like realistic in a lot of things. Because first, and the most important thing, the RCEP is not flexible at all. Like, that's literally something you can Google right now. It's not adaptable, because China, just structural reasons, right? Even if you don't believe it's empirically, China has a fuck ton of FTA agreements with the ASEAN other than this already. They have a fuck ton of free trade agreements with all of these other countries already. Why the heck do they need another free trade agreement, which is more adaptable, more flexible, if they already have all these other things? Is literally the first structural reason I can give you as to why this is not an adaptable thing at any point of time. I'll give you more structural reasons as to why this is going to be extremely problematic, and China is going to be a very bad faith actor through the course of my debate. But 3 ways I'm going to win this. First, I'm going to tell you how this is economically bad for India. Second, I'm going to tell you how it's going to be bad for India in general, and the geopolitics in the region, and for India internally. And third, why the RCEP in itself is very shit and probably shouldn't go forward in the first place, and why this move actually destroys the RCEP. The first, in economic argumentation, I have 4 points in this, right? 5 points in this, right? The first is just to say that the reason why India moved away from this is first, because this actively goes forward and undercuts Indian material and allows China to dump material into India. That's literally the purpose of the RCEP. This is why the RCEP was created by China, in order to go forward and dump material in Asia and all these other places. How does this work? Understand that India is not really an exporting country. This is weird idea coming from Bella that, oh, now India is going to start exporting stuff. India's never been known for exporting stuff. India's biggest thing is services, which you don't need free trade agreements for. I'll go forward and give you structural reasons for this, mostly. But the biggest idea here is that when India does not really have a lot of exporting power, and China is the biggest power where you can export, what this movement essentially does is now China can come in and for very cheaper prices put material into India and like sell it at very cheap prices, which means Indian industry, Indian handicrafts absolutely get fucked at all points of time. But this is also bad for a second reason, right? And this is the biggest structural reason for this, is that you reduce middleman tariffs, which is something that India has never done historically, right? What is a middleman tariff? The idea is simply that, say, countries in the Middle East or countries in Africa can now route materials through China through this free trade agreement, and now they don't even have to pay that middleman tax that you're getting to pay from this, because these other countries don't have to pay the tariffs at this point of time because they're going through a free trade, which means that other countries can also now dump into India at all points of time. And this was something that China was doing at all points of time and trying to force India into it, which is one of the biggest things India does not want at any point of time, because now it opens India up to attack economically from lots of different countries in a lot of places. India does not want that. But third is just that China is incredibly bad and negotiates in bad faith, right? Because generally, even historically, they've been like really bad in terms of negotiating with India. But also second, they're never like adaptable or flexible in these terms of things. I'll structurally prove this later on in my later speeches as well. But generally, as a point that remains. But fourth, India has a historical preference against going into any kind of free trade agreements in the first place, because of the reason I told you, where India is dependent most on services, which means that opening up to free trade agreements generally leads to countries dumping in India, which means that India did not even join the Brick Road initiative to a large extent because of the same reason, because they didn't want to open up to dumping towards India in the first place, which means India does not probably want to be dumped in through a free trade agreement. But also last in this idea, the biggest reason why I have to lose this debate is because they never proved exclusivity, right? India has a lot of other alliances that already exist which can do this. You have the ASEAN, which India already has a lot of trade agreements with first. You have the SAARC, which is basically India plus ASEAN without China anyways. You have the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is again like literally almost the same countries plus Australia and New Zealand. We don't understand why India cares about any, like this one particular thing for India to get any of the benefits that they claim, or even for ASEAN to get any of these benefits they claim, because there's a shit ton of free trade agreements that exist outside of RCEP. They have to come here and prove you exclusive benefits of only the RCEP to show you why this can happen. But like simply this, right? India can start their own agreement if they want to at all points of time. That's not really like something that happens. So simple impacts on our side of the house. 4 different impacts of this first argument. First is simply that this is extremely bad for the Indian industry, right? Now you get dumped in this, which leads to more price volatility, Indian farmers and people getting parked, because understand that Indian consumption is so harsh that they cannot even export even if they wanted to, which means that like say China can just come in and dump shit and like India gets fucked really badly. Second, this leads to lesser bargaining power, engaging straight with 1A when they come and say, oh, now India has more power, but now India is going back into join something, right? Which means China holds all the bargaining chips. All the countries already there probably will be very less willing to break the deals already made, which India is coming from a position of less power to try and break into those deals that's been already made, which is probably really bad. India can make no decisions. Third, it's probably good to have another economic powerhouse in the region other than China, and it's really good that India's economy remains safe. But also fourth, is probably that this whole thing is like now India has a reason to compete against China and upskill in the first place, which like fights with 1A's opposition mechanism. Second condition then is basically the idea of geopolitics and internal politics in the region. 4 different regions with this. First, there's an original dispute that exists with China that still hasn't been solved, like 1A concedes you. We got this still the Galwan dispute happening. You still got China committing atrocities on India, or so India claims. India probably doesn't want that. Second, if you go back into this country, you probably start looking really weak internationally and domestically, which is really bad because India is trying to push this strongman image in the country. They have this revealed preference to being the global leader at that point of time. They don't want to look weak. Third, they probably don't want to deal with China for 3 major reasons. First, historically, China and India have not been on good terms. China helped Pakistan during the 1972 war, etc. But second, ideologically, India and China fight a lot on things like Pakistan, Kashmir, the freedom of Kashmir, freedom of Tibet, etc., which means there's never really going to be any de-escalation like Bella talks about, because ideologically they're extremely wrong. But third, China essentially wants to fuck over India, right? It's a revealed preference for China to use economical terms to fuck countries over politically, to destroy them politically. India probably does not even want to take a risk that happens in the first point of time. And fourth, the citizens hate each other, right? Indians and Chinese people literally hate each other because of the rhetoric that's been pushed at all points of time, which means there's likely to be a like hot voter issue, and voters probably won't like this. What are the impacts? I think 6 different impacts is that first, this probably makes India very dependent on China because now China starts dumping material and India depends on China for this. India's economy gets fucked, so India has to depend on China for this. Second, this actively makes India weak in the region, which is probably really bad. Because third, you need a regional power to counteract China. Why? Because China is really bad with things like attacking the South China Sea, attacking Sri Lanka, etc. You need a regional power to counteract that kind of problem happening because of all the instability that exists. But also fourth, India getting unstable is in general really bad because India is a fucking nuclear power. What do you think happens when nuclear power goes rogue? Like, we've seen enough examples of that. You don't want India getting unstable even generally. But fifth, this alienates India from the USA, right? Because of the kind of anti-China rhetoric that exists in USA, a lot of corporations are also pulling out of USA, which means that this corporate investment that happens in one actually flips to our side. With the signaling effect that One talks about, flips to our side. Because if India starts dealing with China, at this point of time, the signaling effects acts against in your favor because people in the USA, including Trump, are pushing this anti-China rhetoric. Corporations are moving away from China. It's a water issue there, which means corporations probably don't want to invest in India if they say they're moving in China. You already get a lot of investment in India in the status quo because they're anti-China. We want that signaling effect to continue, not joining into China in the first place. But also last, most of the security that people feel in the region is mostly with India, and India existing as a counter to China. Especially a lot of countries come to India to mediate them against China because they think India is the only country that can stop China. That reduces in this point of time because countries think that India is dealing with China more. India is like a lackey of China. We probably don't want that happening. Last, why is the RCEP in itself really bad, right? Because understand that the ASEAN is essentially handicapped and blackmailed into joining this because China has already mostly made them very dependent on them, right? They don't really have any incentive to join this. The only reason Australia and New Zealand came in is for diplomacy and because India was joining in the first place. At this point of time, understand that China is using the RCEP to push and dump material into them and become the sole de facto leader in the region by becoming the strongest and making everyone else relevant on them at all points of time, which means they want to fuck the growth of the ASEAN. That's the long-term impact that China is looking for, which deals with one day's case of, oh, Asia growth will increase. China will never let that happen. China will dump. China will make them resilient on them. What are the impacts of India pulling out? 3 different things. One, now Australia and New Zealand are emboldened to pull out. Second, other countries in the ASEAN now also get emboldened to pull out of the RCEP, which means RCEP becomes weak. China doesn't get to dump as much. China doesn't get to destroy the growth of the ASEAN countries as much. And third, the biggest country is pulled out. This probably means the FTA just becomes very shit. We don't want RCEP. RCEP is shit. Don't support it. Extremely proud to oppose. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, for side opposition, this is not an act to debate. We're not just taking India's perspective, and also unfortunately for side opposition, we don't live in a bubble where only Indian propaganda is true. I want to list out a number of harms that side opposition describes. Firstly, you need a big regional counterweight, and India, when it rejoins this free trade agreement, is no longer going to be a major regional power. Bewildering to me. Literally their best case, where this hurts a little bit of Indian growth, can't counteract China in South China Sea. Huge explanatory gap. But their second impact is just they're going to go rogue and start a nuclear war, and I'm really starting to lose it at this point. I think their most realistic harms are as follows. Firstly, that what this does is actually not increase the amount of free trade, but actually destroy a number of industries within India, which increases the amount of poverty within that country. And I want to immediately flag that in their literal best case, where this does some harm to some Indian companies, by the virtue of Addis's own analysis, that India is a highly illiberal country where a single free trade agreement would cause an explosion in the amount of free trade that is able to be conducted. As some of the biggest tariffs in the world, and one of the largest untapped markets in the world, begins to become far, far more integrated into the world economic order, we think the magnitude of growth that it is likely to occur here is very much in parallel to when China ratified the World Trade Organization and joined as a signatory. That led to significant liberalization reductions in tariffs in China, which started off the Chinese economic miracle. We think a very similar amount of growth is likely to occur. And I think this is plausible for a few reasons. The first is to ask the question, does this increase the amount of free trade, or does it, as Addis describes, lead to a huge amount of dumping and Indian companies being outcompeted? I'm going to start with the question of dumping. I think it has 3 broad problems. The first big problem is, I'm immediately unsure why this isn't just good. India is literally just totally overwhelmed by an enormous anchor of a huge number of highly unproductive industries that cannot effectively outcompete or compete on an international scale, which are super unproductive, which means that the amount of income that they're generating for their genuine citizens is a fraction of what they should be. And we think that those zombie companies that the government is propping up with tremendous amounts of subsidies are causing 2 enormous harms. One is it's causing a huge amount of debt debt on the Indian government. It is having to prop up these industries with enormous amount of state support. That looks like free land, that looks like extensive subsidies, that looks like cheapening their input goods, that looks like paying portions of people's wages or encouraging more employees into these certain areas. We think these enormous sets of costs to the government in the long term is impairing its ability to help people get out of poverty and do other forms of development projects. But secondly, it's because these companies need to be replaced by productive industries. We do think there are highly productive industries within India, like the types of highly arable land with pretty significant and relatively industrialized farms from relatively big oligopolies and sets of companies that do exist within India that have been highly effective, meaning those are the types of companies that survive when trade barriers are put down, and those are the companies that expand and take up these places and buy out these non-successful other companies that no longer can survive without this extensive government support. But it is secondly here, because I'm unsure about why this specialization isn't just good. Maybe yes, a number of Indian businesses do go bankrupt and shut down now. Why is it not the case that that Indonesian worker and its factory that is set up there is not of equal, if not more significant importance? Because we give the structural reasons why actually this is more likely to be of benefit. Firstly, because you get significantly cheaper input goods. The reason why it's propping up in India is because you can produce the goods cheaper there. When you get cheaper goods, that significantly alleviates people's cost of living, but also it allows for cheaper import goods that all of a sudden make a whole bunch of other businesses viable. When you have cheaper coal in India because they're getting a huge amount of that coal from Indonesia instead, we think what that empowers is for your businesses to be able to actually have higher profit margins and begin to produce other forms of good, or particularly to take greater risks. You're only doing this large amount of upscaling and huge amounts of investment when you can make higher profit margins from importing cheaper goods from other sets of countries. We think that's a more significant benefit. But it is secondly, because free trade is only conducted when it's mutually beneficial. Who signs onto a trade deal if they're losing out on it? And what that means is, yes, India might lose out to some extent in the short term in particular, but I think in the long term, this allows for an enormous amount of mutually beneficial win-win situations, which is far more important. The second thing though is, even if you don't think that this dumping actually might be a benefit, this is actually a very common fear. And what that means is there's a number of systems in place in RCEP that strongly mitigate this harm. The first is that there is an entire pillar of RCEP which is on trade resolution mechanisms. In the same way that the World Trade Organization has trade resolution dispute mechanisms, the exact same exists in RCEP. And yes, it's a little bit looser, but it is much better than absolutely nothing at all. But it is second because they can still protect a percentage of their industry. Addis's response here is it's not flexible at all. China overwhelmingly controls it. But the actual structural reasons why RCEP does have a relatively large percentage of goods that you can allocate as not a certain amount of tariffs is firstly because there's so many countries in it, and they all needed to join at some point. And to get the consensus, RCEP is literally the biggest free trade agreement in the world. What that suggests is that it had to make a number of sacrifices, and those sacrifices look like giving certain countries a degree of flexibility. And this was particularly important to get some of the biggest countries, for instance, like Australia or Japan on board, which, for instance, have agricultural industries that cater towards pretty high value sets of goods, think like Wagyu beef in Japan. And those type of countries really wanted to protect those exports with high degrees of tariffs. And so the leading countries, the biggest countries, but also all sorts of developing countries to get on board, wanted to protect certain industries. They protected it through these types of protections. We think India would have the exact same types of protections on that side. But I think the last thing to point out here is the formation of RCEP and where it comes out, because I think side opposition just I think is a little bit oblivious to the history of where RCEP emerges from. It emerges out of the TPP that Obama sets up as an anti-China free trade agreement, and it comes slightly after it, and it emerges out of it because China wants to be a part of this free trade agreement. Countries like Japan and South Korea, for very obvious reasons that they're so proximate to China, really want a free trade agreement with China, but the TPP could never be because Obama said it was explicitly designed to exclude China. And as such, they sign a watered down free trade agreement that would enable China to be able to participate in that agreement. And what that suggests strongly, firstly, is that China was not the initial writer of this type of agreement. There are a number of concessions that were made to China. For instance, it allows for state-owned companies, which India has a fair few of, and which enable China to be able to participate in the same ways that they could in with the CPTPP. But what that strongly suggests is it's still Japan, it's still South Korea, it's still Australia that are some of the leading countries in that and have extensively written the words of that document, which suggests it isn't China that overwhelmingly dominates it. And where it does dominate it to some extent, that actually favors India because they have more similar economic models due to their history. So at the end of this, I think it's deeply improbable that this impoverishes India on a mass scale such that they reap their geopolitical benefits. The more important consideration you ought to have in this debate is simply that we increase the amount of free trade, which leads to growth, leads to more people escaping poverty, more people being unemployed. But if you didn't believe that, I think the second clear way we win this debate is by explaining that India actually makes RCEP better. Because RCEP is a continual process where they add further documentation and further standardization and further rules. And India actually would be a very valuable addition into the writing of that document and a valuable form of expertise. As we explained straight from Bella to no response, India is the world leader of the digital economy. It has some of the highest rates of digital transactions. And it is actually one of the leaders in being able to write legislation that would be highly effective here. We think we get more people out of poverty, and that is the clear benefit that takes us this debate.
I think the question that Eugene asked about like 6 minutes into his speech was pretty true, which was, who signs up to a free trade agreement if they don't benefit from it? True, that's why India didn't sign up to this free trade agreement, right? 3 things in this speech. First, on the impact for Southeast Asia more broadly. Secondly, the economic impact on India. Fourthly, on geopolitics. So let's talk, quickly knock this stuff about the benefit to Southeast Asia more broadly out of the debate. The claim that we get from the Affirmative team is that this empowers free trade in Southeast Asia, which is a good thing because India can both receive goods from other countries and also supply them with goods. Let's deal with each of these things separately. Firstly, on the idea of supply. I think as this debate has already agreed, India doesn't supply an awful lot of agricultural or produced goods. The main export industry in India is services and services relating to technology. The second thing to point out here is that China is also a member of this free trade agreement, right? China can manufacture things incredibly cheaply. They have an incredible lot of arable land themselves. Yes, India is getting trickled down water from one side of the Himalayas. Guess who's on the other side of the Himalayas, right? Presumably that means the land there is equally arable, which means that they can obviously dominate the supply of things like food to these other countries. Deeply unclear that India makes a meaningful impact on the amount of food provided to these other countries in Southeast Asia. Then in terms of them being able to take goods from other countries, I think firstly, as we've already pointed out, there are other trade agreements in place. It is untrue to say that India cannot trade with these other Southeast Asian countries. They literally have things like ASEAN, things like the other ones that Ad mentioned, which means that I don't think it is entirely true to say that these countries are unable to trade with India in the absence of RCEP. Additionally though, we think that this bolsters China's regional domination. It makes the whole of Southeast Asia even more dependent on China because now it is just so much more convenient to trade with China, which is probably bad for Southeast Asia overall. It means China is more empowered to take Taiwan, is more empowered to do power plays in the South China Sea. So not only at worst is this increased regional reliance on China bad, it is probably just at best, not incredibly unique in that it is unclear that India brings that much benefit to the Southeast Asian region that is worth the harms that we present to you. So probably not that good for Southeast Asia to have India in this agreement. Let's talk about India then. I think the first thing to note is, as I've already flagged, India just does economically suffer because of this model. We told you that they try to frame it as though the conditions that were in place when RCEP was first produced are no longer the case, but obviously that is not true because the very conditions of RCEP were what India objected to in the first place. It was the fact that it would reduce import taxes so greatly that China could come in and undercut all of their Indian production, meaning that all of the agriculture that India produced, for example, was less accessible. All the goods that India produced was now less accessible than Chinese goods, meaning that India just could not sell their goods anymore. So obviously, because that hasn't changed, because those conditions are still in place, obviously this is still something that's economically bad. What do we hear from the Affirmative team about why this would be good for India? The first claim they make is that you get an increase in FDI because you're signaling an openness to trade. Firstly, this is just a pretty weak, it's just like a signposting point. Seems quite silly. The second thing to say is that obviously there are other agreements. India isn't totally geographically or economically isolated. Obviously, if you want to believe that India is going to trade with other people, look at all the other trade agreements they're in. The third thing to say, though, is that as Addis outlines, signaling your connection to China doesn't bode particularly well when you have, in terms of your relationship with America or American companies, there is a lot of anti-China sentiment in America at the moment, especially in the lead up to the election, where you have Trump saying that he's super anti-China and Biden therefore being forced to say that he's anti-China, obviously this means that the signal seems quite weak. The next thing to say is that they were like, oh, well now, India becomes less self-reliant, as they're less reliant on their own industries. You can upskill your workforce. Two responses here. The first is that self-reliance actually seems kind of good. I don't know, like maybe it is good not to be dependent on China for your food, for example, when you are so, ideologically opposed to China. The second thing to say is that I just don't think it's true that the reason that workers are unskilled at the moment is because they are doing it purely to service, the demands of, construction, etc. in India. There are obviously other factors, like the fact that, education is quite inaccessible, like high-paid jobs is quite inaccessible, and they're quite limited. All of that means it's super unclear that this is suddenly just massively beneficial for the vast amount of unskilled labourers in India. Thirdly, they say that now farmers can charge a lot of money for their food that they produce, so it's good for farmers. Firstly, as I've already said, China is equally capable of producing the same types of food and in greater quantities than India is. Deeply untrue that Indian food uniquely is so, worth paying lots of money for. Secondly, I don't know if I'm just dumb. Surely food now gets less expensive? They can charge less because of things like tariffs, meaning that you don't actually profit from other countries buying your food massively. Thirdly, it's just India as a whole also becomes less reliant on Indian produce, which means that the main people who are consuming your foods are probably much less likely, they're now consuming foods which are imported from China, which means Indian agriculture and all the farmers that we probably do care about are massively undercut. They just lose a lot of money, lose a lot of jobs. The fourth thing that they say is that at Eugene, is that Indian industry is so ineffective that it's actually probably good if you get China dumping resources there. Surely that contradicts their own characterization about Indian industries being so viable and so capable of trading with the rest of the world, right? Fifthly then, they say, well now you can transform your industry in a particularly helpful way. Firstly, I think this is quite hard to do. A lot of the time, they point to that land being particularly arable. It makes sense that there have been long histories of farming this land, meaning that it's hard to just turn this farming land into microconductors of production or something like that. Obviously there are more obstacles in place than simply needing to provide food for your own people. But secondly, as we've already outlined, China undercuts India's production in the region, meaning sure, India can specialize in something like, rice production, for example. China does that better. Seems unclear that they would do that. So obviously this is economically bad for India. It lessens the amount of money that they can make from exports. They get undercut by China, which means that their industry suffers. It means that the farmers, the people we care about, people making minimum wage because they are doing things like production, suffer because they can just have that produced more cheaply elsewhere. And thirdly, because India has already left the agreement and now they're coming back to it, they just have no negotiating power whatsoever. So all of their material about how there's actually a lot of flexibility simply isn't true, because India has no leverage, right? Which means that the agreement is already in place. The people who agreed to it were China and a bunch of people who are terrified of China. Obviously the conditions are going to be particularly favorable to China. India has no capacity to change that. It's absolutely silly if they would rejoin this agreement. Let's talk about geopolitics. The first thing to note is I think Eugene just severely underrates our material about China. What we tell you quite simply is, if you become reliant on China for things like your food, for things like your industry, you cannot push back against them as meaningfully when they, for example, try to claim that Kashmir should be independent, when they try to claim that Tibet should not be, is part of China. Obviously that is a bad thing. It means that you are less able to push back against them, and that is not only bad for you as a country, because now you are more vulnerable to what China wants from you. It is bad for the region because now China has less opponents within the region. They can do what I mentioned earlier, which is try to claim things in the South China Sea. But additionally, as I've already outlined, there is a strong anti-China sentiment in the US at the moment, which means you necessarily distance yourself from the US, which is bad, again, because China has less of an opposition in the region, but because India wants to be an opponent to China, they get weapons from elsewhere, which is Russia, which we've already pointed to at the moment. Seems quite bad to have Russia being having trade partners, etc. That seems like a global bad. So, clearly what we explained to you is that geopolitically it is terrible to have India become in any way dependent on China, because that strengthens their position in the region. There's no countervailing force there. I guess the only other geopolitical benefit they point, the response that we get from Eugene is super undercooked. They're like, well, China didn't initially write this policy, which means it's not super beneficial to them. Firstly, yes it was, that was why India pulled out in the first place. Secondly, it's just inherently beneficial because it cements the reliance that other countries in the region have on them. Thirdly, as I've already said, there's a decrease in bargaining power. And fourthly, China is already dominant, which means it would just end up being coercive anyway, even if they weren't the initial authors of it. The only other benefit they point to is a better connection with ASEAN. Super unclear, super unimpactful. Clearly we win this debate.
I think the easiest way to see that we win this debate is to look at what happened to other countries when they entered this trade deal. Empirically, has all the other Southeast Asian countries that entered this trade deal immediately suffered the consequences of China's wrath? Have they lost all their development? Have they lost all their growth? And the answer to that is no. This region of the world is growing rapidly, it's gaining huge amounts of investment. The fact that it's more regionally connected has made it more stable, made it more appealing to Western investors and investors throughout Asia, which is why all these countries have received huge amounts of positive growth. This team's narrative about the fear of China, the scary demon that's going to come in and destroy the Indian economy, has not manifested in any other context. And that proves to you, I think quite conclusively, their fears are fake, this team's arguments are thin air, and they haven't actually proved any of them. This will increase investment, will increase growth, it's better for the entire region and we ought to support it. Firstly, how does this impact the Indian economy? Secondly, how does it impact the broader economy in Asia? And thirdly, on geopolitics. Firstly then, on how this impacts the Indian economy, I'd note this isn't the largest part of the debate. Southeast Asia is a huge region, and all the other countries also matter. I'm only addressing this in a large part because it is where the thrust of their case is. Their first claim is that, well, China dumps goods on you, which means it undercuts your manufacturing industry. The first problem with this is I think we quite neatly flip it at Eugene, and the easiest way to concretize this is to consider what is it that steel that comes from China is being used on. It's being used for development. That steel gets used to make buildings, it gets used to make manufacturing facilities, it gets used to grow the Indian economy in other sectors, which just diversifies the Indian economy, because it means you are now no longer reliant on producing raw materials like steel. It means you can diversify into other sectors of the economy, and having access to cheaper goods from China is massively beneficial towards that process of diversification, which is why it's probably not that big a harm if you have to trade off maybe losing some of your manufacturing of steel to get other forms of development. But secondly, it's unclear why when you look at other kinds of manufacturing industries, India would get so drastically outcompeted by other countries in the region, other members of this trade deal. And that's because India has a similar comparative advantage to the other countries that this team claims would outcompete them. They also have cheap labor, they also have large amounts of development, they have robust manufacturing industries. I would argue actually India has quite a competitive edge over these other countries. And the reason for that is because in addition to having all of this cheap labor and this established manufacturing industry, they also have a massive domestic market of 1 billion people, which makes it quite desirable to put your manufacturing in India, where you can also get better access to that Indian market in addition to putting your manufacturing in there, which I think explains to you why this flood of manufacturing out of India is just improbable. Ask yourself, why would that occur? Why would it not just stay in India? The answer is it probably would. India can compete, even within a free trade deal. In order to provide why we need protectionism, they need to prove why they don't have that edge, and they never did that. Second claim they make then is that, well, other countries, like the US, will be scared off by this closer connection to China and stop investing in India. The first problem with this is investment is not done by Donald Trump and it's not done by Joe Biden. It's done by private firms. And these private firms don't buy into the same kinds of racist narratives about China this team talks about. They actually see China as quite appealing because they know that that is also a similarly profitable market, and an economy that's closer connected to that market just gives them further access to the entire Asian region, and that's probably a benefit. But secondly, even if it were true, I think it has probably the opposite effect. That is, if India is seen to be getting closer to China, that just encourages the US to outcompete China's influx on the region, which explains to you why you actually increase the amount of FDI and increase growth, even if you believe in the conception of how that growth and investment is conducted. Third claim they make then is that, well, India is not an exporting country, it's a service economy, so it doesn't need any of this. The first problem with this is free trade agreements are good for service countries too. Like, you can export services. Other countries can access your economy, even if you are a service economy. Australia still has exports, even though it is also a service economy. And a second problem with this though, is I think some parts of India could just still benefit a lot from exporting, even if they don't, even if they do have large service sectors. Note that, like, when we explain why they do have a powerful agricultural industry, the response is like, well, the other side of the Himalayas is also strong. The problem with mountains is one side is arable and the other side is desert. India happens to be the arable side of that mountain. That's what the weather system is, which is why they have such mineral-rich soils and are able to do so much agricultural exploitation. Fourth claim they make then is that, well, India has lots of other trade deals. This isn't an exclusive benefit with this. The first problem with this is Addis directly contradicts themselves throughout the entirety of the speech, because they claim in setup that, well, India has a revealed preference not to be in trade deals, and then claims they're actually part of a fuck ton of trade deals. Clearly only one of these conceptions of India can be true. But secondly, the actual reality is the only one of these trade deals which India has meaningfully participated in and not retained large amounts of protectionism throughout is the preliminary trade deal that it has with Australia, because it has quite a close connection concession with Australia, but the other trade deals that it is a part of have maintained large amounts of protectionism, and the consequence of that is that the other countries that are part of that trade deals have also been able to keep their protectionism against India, which is why it hasn't significantly expanded their trade options. But thirdly, this is just uncomparative. Obviously, an additional trade deal with a larger number of countries all in the same trade deal is a massive delta. Final claim they make then is that, well, you have no negotiating power. The problem with this is your negotiating power doesn't come from the stage at which you joined the agreement. It comes from how large your market is, because these other countries in the trade bloc also want India to be a part of the trade deal, which is why they make concessions to get India in there, because it is one of the biggest markets in the world. It has 1 billion people who are increasingly becoming wealthy, a growing middle class, which is why they make concessions and allow India to join without making huge compromises to its economy. Let's weigh this. Do not listen to their fears about China. Chinese investment has empirically been really good for a lot of Asian nations, and it can be equally good for India. And just consider how big the win we land on investment is. India now has access to the Asian market. It is more stable. It is way more appealing to Western investors and other Asian investors and investors within India, which causes a huge amount of growth and probably lifts a large number of people out of poverty. That is a win which outcompetes all the other issues in the state, and it's just super clearly true. Next issue then, the broader economy in Asia. Their first claim is that, well, India has nothing to export, it's a service economy, so it wouldn't benefit other countries. The first response to this is the same one that I gave previously, which is that you can also export services, and making those services cheaper in other countries just reduces the amount of cost of living that is there. But secondly, there are a number of goods that India is capable of exporting, and I would say that the fact that it doesn't export a large amount now is probably a consequence of the protectionism that exists, a consequence of the tariffs. The fact that India is not an export economy now does not prove that it could not be in the future. And I think it's a very good thing if that economy, if that production capacity was spread throughout Asia, and that has huge humanitarian benefits beyond just the economy. Because when goods become cheaper in Southeast Asia, it means that people's livelihoods become cheaper. That means they have more money, they can put more food on the table, they can live better lives, and all of that enables them to self-actualize in better ways, and lands us another huge win. The second claim then is, well, it makes other countries more dependent on China, but it's totally unclear to me how this happens. Like, surely it happens the other way, right? Like, if countries only have a free trade agreement with China, because China is the main player in this free trade agreement, then the trade with China goes up and other countries' dependence on China massively increases. What this does is it enables India to far better compete with China to these other South Asian countries. And the reason for that is because there are now fewer tariffs, there is fewer protectionism, which means rather than having one fewer regional power, because somehow this free trade deal has crippled India so much that it's no longer relevant in the global scheme, what it actually does is enables India to compete in the economic markets of Asia in a way that it presently is not doing, which provides an alternative power in the region to China rather than crippling the current power. I think what that proves to you is that to the extent that India, even if it did lose investment, and that manufacturing flowed out of India, that still provides benefits to the rest of South Asia and wins this debate. I think we also explain though why there are mutual benefits here in both regions grow. Finally, let's talk about geopolitics. Their claim is that, well, self-reliance is good. The problem with this is there are a number of ways that free trade agreements alleviate the need for self-reliance. That's firstly, you're less susceptible to things like price shocks because you have other trade options. But secondly, the diversity of trade partners reduces your dependence on other people, which increases the extent you are able to have agency. But thirdly, the types of economic coercion they claim that China would engage in, they wouldn't be able to do, because economic coercion by China relies on them instituting things like tariffs, which this free trade agreement would block them from doing, which explains why the coercion that they say would cripple you if you weren't self-reliant just cannot manifest in a world in which you have signed this agreement. 3 reasons, very proud to negate.
Affirmative lies to you when they tell you that RCEP has helped all the other countries that are initially involved in it anyway. We would say this is a lie. Seeing the COVID pause and the host of over-reliance that has precipitated a chokehold over the region on behalf of China, and given many other reasons that could explain the rise of this region, it was unclear why RCEP, even if you believe these economies were doing far greater, was that reason. But India wasn't every other country that was involved in RCEP. We tell you pretty clearly from the beginning that their economy structuring is far different, that they do things like have massive over-reliance on services. And given their own characterization of first as India as more of a receiver rather than a giver in these kinds of contexts, it was unclear the kinds of outcomes they thought would play. But also, India has a specific history and geopolitics with China that all these other countries don't. Like, Cambodia does not have the same kind of sway and ability to pull and push geopolitical tides in the same way that India does. India has massive levels of conflicts and casualties across borders in far, far extremely ways, and a historical hatred between many peoples within these countries of that region. India was not like the other members of RCEP, but even if it was, that was not good enough. I'm going to do 3 things in this speech. First of all, I'm going to talk about the internal economic impacts on this debate for India. Then I'm going to talk about the broader economic impacts throughout the region. And lastly, a point on geopolitics. So, first of all, before I get into the argument about the internal benefits that India is likely to get, I'm just going to start with a simple piece of weighing that this is the most important in the debate, comparatively to the economic benefits they push for other nations in the RCEP. That is because the scale of change you must believe is going to be far greater if you believe the harms we give you for India. Because that's flipping, moving back and forth. If you believe what they tell you at Second Affirmative, that, we do want to crush the factories of India and they should, go away, these indigenous sectors were not good enough, and we want them to massively change the construction of their economy immediately, that is industry collapse. That is thousands of people who do rely on these things being massively, resources massively dumped in this nation. And maybe in the long term, there'll be some sort of benefit, but at least you must know that the immediate and certain harm that you're likely to accrue is very bad. Compare that to what they tell you. They want you to believe that we're solving food insecurity and these other problems by having, on top of the massive amounts of goods that China already provides the region, supplemented with a little bit more of Indian goods, and assuming that that will do things like fix price problems, like being able to provide benefits where they did not exist currently. If you believe that exists, the massive impact of it is A, speculative, but B, incredibly diluted to the point in which it was not comparative to the harms we give you. So, why do we believe this is likely to cause mass over-reliance on behalf of the Indian economy, and therefore all the harms that we give you are able to unlock? We tell you that given the simple intuition that India pulled out to begin with because the terms of these trade deals were not favourable to them, because of the fact that things like middleman tariffs would really fuck over their economy, it would undercut local products, that was likely to be incredibly big to begin with. They tell us, oh, well, it's a contradiction to say that, they have some FTAs, even though we say they have a general opposition. We would say the extent to which they have power over these is likely to be incredibly, is very different. That is to say that negotiating directly with China is very difficult for the Indian economy due to the relative size, but compared to other traders, actors, especially those who have more closer historical ties with, is likely to be done a lot better. But additionally, the ties of free trade agreement that these are likely to form are far greater. We tell you that the unreasonable power that China has is incredibly important. They say, it's based on the size of your economy, and India is pretty big too. India is not comparable in this case. They're multiple times of magnitude bigger than they are in terms of, smaller than they are in terms of China in the first place. Which means that all the benefits, the harms that we give you are likely to happen. That looks like collapsing industry. That looks like having a massive reliance on Chinese goods because Chinese manufacturing just does it better. They have the entire ecosystem there to begin with. Chinese farming tends to do it better. They have far more amounts of arable land. I'm not going to talk about mountains. At the end of that, basically, it's pretty clear that China is likely to be made worse. What are their pushes? Their first push is basically to suggest, that these industries can compete, which is what they tell you at third. 3 ways to respond to this. First of all, I think this is entirely asserted. Maybe they have a little bit more arable land, but it's unclear that they have the same amount of focus and government investment in maybe history and scale of agricultural products that China has, especially considering the state of the market at the moment. Second of all, that is entirely in conflict with the other characterizations they give you. Eugene tells you what the benefit of crushing them. I think it's pretty clear that these industries could not compete, and given that they cite the very farmers' protests that meant they didn't join in the first place, these are not favourable terms for the agricultural sector. If so, they would have likely to opt into them. Third of all, it's unclear also the comparative advantage that India uniquely has, which means that if you want to change the structure of their economy entirely and be able to remove that self-reliance that's allowed India to flourish in the past, it has to be a massive benefit that they're able to accrue later, given the kind of growing pains that is likely to happen in that respect. What is our next idea here? That is to say that, the earlier version of the case, which is that, dumping is good, we believe this is wrong for a couple of reasons. First of all, because that assumes that therefore the power goes to China. Because if there is dumping and you are relying on those goods to begin with, therefore, it means that India just has a reliance on that in the first place. And this is bolstered by the high demand that they tell us of, which means if you collapse the local industry, they must rely on the biggest player, which will be China. Additionally, their kind of benefits to the farming sector are unlikely to accrue, especially given the framing we've given down the bench. So at the end of that, that India is not able to compete with China in the ways that they suggest they will be able to. And in their best case, in many circumstances, where they say it will allow India to overly specialise, A, it was unclear why this wouldn't happen anyway, but B, the likely the harms you accrue along the way are likely to be particularly devastating for that economy. India made the choice that it was was not good enough for them in 2019, it's unlikely to change. The benefit, the particular harm we then give, is that because you enter later, even though all those reasons we gave you to begin with are likely to become particularly bad. They are, this is done with on a case-by-case basis. But you must believe that the simple pillars of this trade structure have already been decided, and to the extent to which people are willing to break these original terms or able to massively deal with India than every other actor, considering they haven't been historically involved, is incredibly small. So why then do we believe there's a geopolitical harm that is likely to be particularly important here? We tell you that historically, all the context we give you at the beginning of the speech, that there is a revealed preference against a relationship between India and China that is given the history of border disputes, trying to encircle each other, these major tensions which are likely, and these major hatreds which are likely to keep persisting. The impact and the harm that we give you that at first, which is under-responded to, is that you cannot take hard stances as India anymore. Because in the case in which you want to say, we do want an independent Tibet, you cannot do that with the risk of absolutely causing hunger in your population. In the case that China has, as they historically have used their economic might to levy against any kind of political opposition. That was incredibly bad. The second independent harm we give you is that this dissuades foreign actors like the US from going in the first place. They say, well, it's not the government who was making these trade agreements. We tell you at least there exists a pressure on business to act in accordance. If there are things like, for example, trade restrictions, it's likely that if there's a massive freak out about India being besties with China, those are likely to extend in meaningful ways to India. That was probably an incredibly bad thing. And additionally, we tell you this is likely to look incredibly weak, both foreign and domestically. At the end of this speech, it is pretty clear. India will be over-reliant on China if they join this agreement. They don't have the power that China has, and they cannot use any kind of lobbying power or bargaining power they could have had because they are joining so late. At the very least, at their very best, they're able to prove some sort of economic flexibility in the region without proving why specifically it was this policy with India that would be the necessary tipping point to getting all of those benefits, and noting that all the kind of, and last of all, that we suggest to you that there is some sort of geopolitical harm that happens. If the US has any hopes of trying to kind of counter Chinese influence, their biggest alliance in this case would have to be India, and allowing India to basically mortgage out their economy to China is a really bad idea. Proud to negate.
I think the affirmative reluctance to engage with the concept in this debate of China as a geopolitical threat is quite telling. We point to the broad harms of China gaining more regional power, the fact and getting more, having other countries being economically dependent on them. Looks like enabling them to do things like claim territory, to indebt other countries to them, to coerce those other countries that are now economically reliant on China into making political decisions or other agreements that were favourable to China and fucked over all of those other countries. And we also pointed to the fact this meant this just empowered them as a military power because it decreased the resistance they were likely to face from countries like India in the first place. If you care about the Southeast Asian region, you should care about China being, being a dominant power in the Southeast Asian region. This is the impact you should care about in this debate. India abstaining from joining RCEP leads to there being less power for China, because you do have another powerhouse in this region that has the capacity to oppose them. It leads to having alternatives for development for these Southeast Asian countries. It looks like having a US foothold in the region that simply would not exist if they made their relationship with India with China closer. Compare this then to what they get in their best case, which is a marginal economic benefit or export benefit for Southeast Asia, who, note alternatively, under this model, still can trade with each other, still can trade with China and get all of this cheap food from China through RCEP, which they are a part of irrespective of whether India is or not, who can still trade with India through other mechanisms. Seems that this benefit is incredibly marginal. Compare this to the geopolitical harm to the region that we point to. I think we win pretty clearly there. Let's talk about the impact on India then. The first thing to note is that we tell you that you just reduce the amount of money that India is able to make from their products because you can't charge the same amount of tariffs, which means that insofar as India does have tradable goods, they just make a lot less money from them. You lose the middleman tariff as well. The Indian economy as a whole suffers. Seems pretty bad. Secondly, we tell you that you undercut local Indian industries, which is bad for, I think, a pretty sympathetic group in this debate. People in India, like farmers, who are reliant on these agricultural industries, who get fucked over and cannot feed their families if they do not have access to that income. We would note as well that we hear no clear alternative to what happens to local industry coming from the affirmative bench. It's quite nebulous. They say things like, oh, well, we can diversify. They never prove that this is like, oh, India can diversify. They never prove that this is something that is possible, that's something that would happen easily in the, given that China is now supplementing these goods. And additionally, it's just unclear that becoming dependent on China for food empowers you as a nation, empowers you in your independence. So weighing this, firstly, I think India just is a pretty big country, seems like a pretty big class of stakeholders, a pretty big impact of what happens internally. But even if we're just talking about, even if you don't buy that, I think the obvious biggest delta in this debate occurs within India because RCEP still exists for all these other countries. So, given that the person or the country that is most impacted by the outcomes of this debate is massively harmed by this agreement, it seems like an impact that you should care about. Okay. Therefore, because we point quite extensively to the geopolitical harms to the countries, to all of the countries involved in this agreement, except for China, who benefits massively, which seems like a loss for the world, because we tell you that India as a country, as an economy suffers, because we say that Southeast Asia doesn't benefit massively from this policy, we are so proud to negate it.
Let's start by considering if India does actually receive a benefit from this policy, because that is what this negative team hangs their hat on, despite it not being an activate. And what they tell us is that the amount of resource dumping that will occur from China into India is just a bad thing, and they care so deeply about that in this debate. But we explained to you down the bench to virtually no response that you can just develop your industry in a far better way when this kind of dumping occurs. But also that at the point where it does just shut down local industries, we explained to you at Charlie that probably is a good thing. We've noted the fact that unproductive industries are just a massive strain on a huge number of economies, and India is just no exception to that. But also, I think this team just completely underweighs the power that India actually has in this situation, because they are just an economic superpower. They do have competitive advantages, and they are specialized in technology and produce huge volumes of it. And it's just unclear why smaller countries would have entered this deal that have far less of a capability to compete with China if they weren't going to receive any benefits. And empirically, they just have, and they are far less able to compete than India is. So clearly, by that logic, India should absolutely enter in it. But the other thing we would note is that clearly services just can be exported. This team is afactual. Australia exports a huge amount of education, Singapore exports a huge amount of services, and they still are able to meaningfully compete in global trade. Their final Hail Mary is that US is going to pull out of funding India. And the problem with this is simply that if China is as big and bad as that team says they are, obviously the US will just try to outcompete China, so clearly they will just invest in India anyway. They also just have other incentives to invest in India beyond this. And the other thing to note here is that probably the good advantage of India joining this agreement is that it is just another player to break up apparently China's huge amount of control over this trade deal. And that is something that you can only claim when India is a part of it. And all of their stuff about how this trade deal isn't exclusive and you have other options at your disposal is just not true. This is an exclusive trade deal. India is not a part of any others. And that means the proportionate difference that this trade deal will have on you is just massive. Secondly, let's talk about if they actually have any leverage in this situation. Because I think Charlie's observation is quite astute, which is that it doesn't matter when you join a trade deal, it matters how large you are. And India would just be one of the biggest countries in this trade deal now. And that just necessarily does give them a huge, huge amount of bargaining power. When you're not a signatory at all, you are incredibly isolated, and that is obviously terrible. Finally, let's respond to their material about how India is going to end up over-reliant on China. The first thing we would note, which we told you down the bench, is there are plenty of countries that trade with China that are not reliant on China. For example, the USA, not even slightly reliant on China, and they certainly do trade with them. But second of all, it's far better that they do this trade with with China under RCEP than independently. So we explained to you at Charlie that they'll probably have to trade with China anyway, considering that China is just such an important economic powerhouse. So would you prefer doing it as a part of RCEP, where you have limitations and restrictions and protections, or would you prefer doing it independently? And clearly we would prefer the former. Finally, even if they are reliant, the impact that trade explosion would have on the constituents of India is just so massive that we would cop that reliance on China for the flow-down benefits that it would have on India's population. But secondly, do we think India actually provides a benefit? Because negative is just wholly unresponsive to this entire argument and mitigates down all of our benefits to them being a service economy. But we explain continually that widening the prospects of trade does just decrease the cost of goods and services for people on the ground, because it creates that meaningful competition that actually allows for consumer choice and actually allows them to pick a cheaper option. It means that individuals are actually able to survive in a cost of living crisis, and the integration of this up and coming bloc of that is Southeast Asia only works when the biggest players like India are involved, and that you can only get on our side. How should you weigh this debate? Because it is clearly about if India should do so. So even if we have to cop all of the economic harms on India specifically and potential reliance on China, that is okay, because the benefits that we get to citizens living in Southeast Asia of being able to alleviate so many of them out of poverty by increasing their options of trade are just absolutely massive, and the volume of people is just so much bigger. We must win this debate.